Colorado Territory, 1875. The sun crawled across the vast sky like a wounded soldier, slow and determined, casting long shadows over the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. Miles Thompson dismounted his tired mare at the edge of the Evergreen Ranch, his weathered hat pulled low against the glare. His saddlebags contained everything he owned in this world: 2 shirts, a spare pair of trousers, his father's pocket watch, and $17 to his name. The last 3 years working trail drives had left him with little more than calloused hands and a reputation as a man who could gentle even the wildest Mustang. "This has to work," he muttered to his horse, Penny. The animal nickered softly in response, as if understanding the desperation in her master's voice. 5 miles away, inside the sprawling main house of the Evergreen Ranch, Frances Eleanor stood at her office window, the leather-bound ledger forgotten on her desk. Through her brass spyglass, a gift from her late father, she observed the lean figure approaching on horseback. Her breath caught slightly at the familiar silhouette. "He's here," she said to her housekeeper, Mrs. Abernathy, who was arranging tea on the sideboard. "The drifter?" the older woman asked, her tone making clear her disapproval. "I still don't understand why you'd hire a man sight unseen." Frances lowered the spyglass, her expression carefully neutral despite the flutter in her chest. "Not sight unseen. I saw him break that stallion at the Morrison Ranch last spring. Any man who can gentle a horse like that without cruelty has skill worth paying for." What Frances didn't mention was how she'd been following Miles Thompson's reputation across 3 counties for nearly a year now, or how she'd deliberately outbid 2 other ranches for his services when word reached her that he was looking for work. Some things were better kept to herself, especially when you were the wealthiest unmarried woman in Jefferson County and the subject of endless speculation. "Besides," she added, smoothing her practical riding skirt, "with half our hands gone to the silver mines, we need experienced cowboys." She set down the spyglass. "I'll meet him at the stables." "Alone?" Mrs. Abernathy's eyebrows shot up toward her gray hairline. Frances smiled. "This is my ranch, Mrs. Abernathy. I'll conduct my business as I see fit." Miles approached the imposing ranch house with trepidation. The Evergreen spread was legendary. 20,000 acres of prime grazing land, the finest Morgan horses this side of the Mississippi, and a widow who ran it all with an iron will, if the stories were to be believed. He'd never met Frances Eleanor, but her reputation preceded her. Inherited the ranch when her husband died of typhoid just 2 years into their marriage, turned down countless suitors and purchase offers, and somehow managed to double the ranch's profits in 5 years. Some called her a cold-hearted businesswoman. Others claimed she was simply waiting for a man worthy of her hand. Miles cared little for gossip. He just needed work. As he approached the stables, a woman emerged from the shadows. Her riding habit was of fine quality but practical, her auburn hair neatly pinned beneath a modest hat. There was nothing ostentatious about her appearance, yet something in her bearing made him straighten in his saddle. "Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice surprisingly warm. "Welcome to Evergreen Ranch." Miles removed his hat. "Ma'am, I've come about the position." "Yes," she said, her eyes studying him with unexpected intensity. "I know exactly why you're here." Something in her tone sent a curious shiver down his spine. It was almost as if she'd been expecting him specifically, not just hiring another drifter passing through. But that was impossible. Frances Eleanor wouldn't know Miles Thompson from Adam. "The foreman's cabin has been prepared," she continued, gesturing toward a small but well-maintained structure near the edge of the property. "You'll start tomorrow. $6 a week, with meals provided." Miles blinked in surprise. Foreman? He'd come seeking work as a ranch hand, and $6 was nearly twice the going rate. "Ma'am, I think there's been some mistake. I'm just looking for work as a cowhand." A smile touched the corner of her mouth. "No mistake, Mr. Thompson. Evergreen Ranch needs a foreman, and from what I've heard of your work with horses, you're the man for the job." She turned to go, then paused. "Unless you'd prefer to move on?" The question hung in the air between them. Miles had been drifting for 3 years since losing his family's small ranch to drought and debt. The idea of responsibility, of putting down roots, made his chest tight with something between longing and fear. "No, ma'am," he finally said. "I'll take the job." "Good." That smile again, mysterious and somehow knowing. "Dinner is at 7 in the main house. Don't be late." As she walked away, Miles couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just stepped into something much bigger than a simple job offer. What could a woman like Frances Eleanor possibly want with a broke cowboy like him? That evening, as Miles washed the trail dust from his face in the surprisingly comfortable foreman's cabin, he spotted something curious on the small bookshelf. A copy of the Iliad. Its spine cracked from frequent reading. It was the very same edition his mother had read to him as a boy, before consumption took her. He ran his fingers over the worn cover, wondering what kind of foreman had left such a book behind. The sun had barely cleared the eastern ridge when Miles began his first day at Evergreen. To his surprise, Frances herself was already in the stables, dressed in practical riding clothes, her hair braided simply down her back. Without the formal attire of the previous day, she looked younger, less severe. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson," she said, tightening the cinch on a spirited bay mare. "I thought I might show you the north pastures myself." The ranch hands exchanged glances. Clearly, this was unusual behavior for their employer. "Happy to accompany you, Mrs. Eleanor," Miles replied, keeping his tone professional despite his confusion. "Miss," she corrected, swinging easily into her saddle. "I never took my late husband's name. A peculiarity of mine." As they rode, Frances pointed out boundaries, water sources, and problem areas with the precision of someone who knew every inch of her land. She was knowledgeable in a way few ranch owners, male or female, ever bothered to be. "Your previous foreman kept excellent records," Miles commented, impressed by the operation. A shadow crossed Frances's face. "Joshua was dedicated. He passed quite suddenly last winter. Pneumonia. I'm sorry for your loss. He was a good man. Loyal." She studied Miles with that same penetrating gaze from the day before. "Tell me, Mr. Thompson, what happened to your family's ranch near Pueblo?" The drought couldn't have been the only factor. Miles pulled his horse up short. "How did you know about that?" Instead of answering, Frances pointed to a ridge in the distance. "That line marks the beginning of Tucker's property. He's been trying to buy this section from me for 2 years, claims he needs the water rights. Last month, 3 of my cattle were found shot." The abrupt change of subject left Miles reeling, but the implication was clear. There were dangers here she wasn't fully explaining. "Why not sell?" he asked. "If there's trouble brewing, this land is mine," she said simply, her jaw set in a determined line. "I won't be bullied off it by Tucker or anyone else." As they continued riding, Miles couldn't shake 2 unsettling realizations. Frances Eleanor knew far more about him than she should, and she was deliberately placing him in the middle of some local conflict he didn't fully understand. By the end of his first week, Miles had begun to understand the rhythm of Evergreen Ranch. The men respected him, if cautiously. The cattle were healthy, the horses exceptional. But there were whispers about Frances, about the previous foreman's untimely death, about why a woman of her standing hadn't remarried. "She watches you, you know," said Hank, one of the older hands, as they mended fence line together. "Same way she watched Joshua before you." "Meaning what, exactly?" Miles drove a post into the ground with perhaps more force than necessary. Hank shrugged. "Just saying, boss. The widow Eleanor doesn't take special interest in just anyone." "She's not a widow. She never took her husband's name," Miles corrected automatically, then wondered why he felt compelled to defend her. That night, unable to sleep, Miles lit a lamp and found himself once again drawn to the copy of the Iliad. As he opened it, a folded paper slipped from between the pages, a letter, unsealed. The handwriting was elegant, feminine. "My dearest J. If you are reading this, then I have finally found the courage to explain everything. The burden of silence has become too great to bear alone. What happened that night at the river wasn't your fault. We were children, powerless against the current and the choices of adults. I have carried the weight of our secret for 20 years, but I can no longer." The letter ended abruptly and signed. Miles carefully refolded and returned it to the book, his mind racing with questions. Who was Jay? What secret had burdened the writer for 20 years? And why was this unfinished, unsent letter hidden in his cabin? The next morning, Frances was waiting for him at the stables again. "We have trouble," she said without preamble. "Tucker's men drove about 50 head of our cattle across the property line last night." Miles frowned. "That's outright theft. We should notify the sheriff." "Sheriff Grayson dines at Tucker's table every Sunday," Frances replied bitterly. No, we handle this ourselves. Gather 5 men, the ones you trust most. We're bringing our cattle home. Hours later, as they approached Tucker's ranch, Miles pulled alongside Frances. This is risky, he warned. Tucker isn't known for his reasonable nature. Neither am I, Mr. Thompson. For the first time, he saw a flash of steel in her eyes that made him understand how this woman had held on to her ranch against all odds. As they crested the hill overlooking Tucker's main pasture, Frances suddenly raised her hand, signaling the men to stop. Below them, Tucker and at least 10 armed men were waiting, their rifles gleaming in the afternoon sun. It appears we were expected, she said quietly. It's an ambush, Miles replied, his hand moving instinctively toward his gun. We need to retreat. But Frances was staring at something else, a man standing slightly apart from Tucker's group. Even from this distance, Miles could see the tension in her posture. Impossible, she whispered. It can't be him. Before Miles could ask who she meant, gunfire erupted from the trees to their right. Their horses reared in panic as bullets kicked up dust around them. Fall back, Miles shouted, grabbing Frances's reins and wheeling both their horses around. As they galloped away, he caught a glimpse of her face, not frightened, as he'd expected, but transformed with a mixture of shock and something that looked remarkably like hope. That evening, after ensuring everyone had returned safely to Evergreen, Miles found Frances alone in her study. Maps of the territory were spread across her desk, and a glass of whiskey sat untouched at her elbow. Who did you see today? He asked without preamble. When you said it can't be him, who were you talking about? Frances didn't look up from her maps. You should rest, Mr. Thompson. Tomorrow will be another long day. No. Miles surprised himself with his firmness. I nearly got shot today riding into what was clearly a trap. My men could have been killed. I deserve answers. Finally, she raised her eyes to his. In the lamplight, they shimmered with unshed tears. Matthew, she said softly. My brother Matthew. But it's impossible because Matthew has been dead for 15 years. Miles felt as if the floor had tilted beneath him. Your brother? I don't understand. Frances moved to the window, looking out at the darkness. When I was 16, Matthew and I were caught in a flash flood while fishing. I survived. They never found his body. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly. Today, I would swear on my life that I saw him standing with Tucker's men. Could it have been someone who resembles him? She shook her head. Matthew had a distinctive scar, from his left eye to his jaw. The man I saw today had that exact scar. Miles approached her cautiously. If your brother is alive, why would he be with Tucker? Why wouldn't he have come home? That, Frances said, turning to face him, is what we need to discover. For the first time, Miles realized how close they were standing. He could smell the faint lavender scent of her hair, see the determined set of her jaw. Something shifted between them, a moment of understanding, of shared purpose. We'll find out the truth, he promised. She studied his face. Why would you help me? You barely know me. The question caught him off guard. Why indeed? He'd come here for a job, not to be drawn into family mysteries and range wars. Yet something about Frances Eleanor had gotten under his skin from the moment he'd arrived. Because, he said slowly, I think you hired me for a reason. And it wasn't just to manage your ranch. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. Perhaps you're right, Mr. Thompson. She returned to her desk, pulling a worn journal from a drawer. This was Joshua's, my previous foreman. Before he died, he was investigating something about Tucker's operation, something illegal. His last entry mentions a man with a scarred face. As Miles took the journal, their fingers brushed, sending an unexpected current between them. Frances drew back quickly, her professional demeanor returning. Read it tonight, she said. We'll talk in the morning. Later, alone in his cabin, Miles pored over Joshua's journal by lamplight. The entries detailed cattle movements, ranch business, and increasingly suspicious activities at Tucker's property. The final entry, dated just 3 days before Joshua's death, was particularly disturbing. Asterisk saw the scarred man again today. T calls him the ghost. Something big happening next month. Heard them mention a government shipment. Need to warn F, but must have proof first. Meeting contact in town tomorrow. Asterisk the next page was blank. Joshua never made it back from town. Miles was so engrossed in the journal that he almost missed the soft knock at his door. When he opened it, Frances stood there, a shawl pulled tight around her shoulders against the night chill. I couldn't sleep, she said simply. May I come in? As she entered, Miles was acutely aware of the impropriety. A single woman visiting a man's cabin after dark. Yet Frances seemed unconcerned with such conventions. I've been thinking about what Joshua discovered, she said, pacing the small room. Tucker's always been involved in shady business, but this sounds bigger. Government shipment, Miles quoted from the journal. Could be anything. Money, weapons. Gold, Frances said firmly. The Denver Mint ships gold south through this territory. It would be worth killing for. She stopped suddenly, noticing the open copy of the Iliad on his table. You found the book. Something in her tone made Miles look closer. Was it yours? She approached the table slowly. It was my father's. Then Matthew's. I left it here hoping. She trailed off, her composure faltering. Hoping what? Frances ran her fingers over the worn cover. Joshua found evidence that Matthew might be alive 3 months before he died. I left this book in the cabin as a message, something only Matthew would understand. But I'm not Matthew, Miles said gently. She looked up at him, vulnerability replacing her usual confidence. No, you're not. But you remind me of him. Your kindness with the horses, your sense of justice. She swallowed hard. When I first saw you breaking that stallion at Morrison's ranch, I thought my heart would stop. You have his same patience, his hands. Understanding dawned on Miles like a slow sunrise. You've been watching me since before you hired me. Frances nodded, looking almost ashamed. I heard your name from a horse trader in Denver. He said you had a gift, like my brother. I went to see for myself, and... She hesitated. You were so much like him, yet entirely yourself. I tracked your movements for months, waiting for a chance to offer you the position here. The revelation should have angered him, being observed, manipulated even. Instead, Miles felt an unexpected warmth spreading through his chest. This proud, independent woman had seen something in him worth pursuing. Why not just tell me this from the beginning, he asked. Would you have believed me? Or would you have thought me a lonely widow inventing reasons to hire a handsome stranger? Her cheeks colored slightly at her own words. The candid admission hung in the air between them. Miles took a step closer, drawn by a pull he couldn't explain. Is that all I am to you? A reminder of your brother? Frances met his gaze, something new flickering in her eyes. No, Miles. Not anymore. The sound of his given name on her lips broke something loose inside him. Without thinking, he reached for her hand. She didn't pull away. Before either could speak, hoofbeats pounded outside, followed by urgent shouting. Miles rushed to the window in time to see the night sky glowing orange above the northern pasture. Fire, he said grimly. Tucker's making his move. Dawn broke over Evergreen Ranch, revealing the charred remains of the north pasture fence line. Miles and the ranch hands had fought the blaze through the night, managing to save the grazing land. But the message was clear. Tucker was escalating the conflict. Frances surveyed the damage from horseback, her face set in grim determination. He's testing our defenses, she said as Miles rode up beside her. The cattle drive to the railroad is in 3 days. He knows we'll be vulnerable. The unspoken tension from their interrupted conversation the previous night simmered beneath their practical exchange. Miles found himself watching the sunlight play across her features, wondering what might have happened if they hadn't been interrupted. We should postpone the drive, he suggested, forcing his mind back to the problem at hand. We can't. The contract is binding. If we don't deliver on time, we lose the entire payment. She turned to face him fully. This ranch is everything to me, Miles. Not just land and livestock, but the legacy my father built, that Matthew and I were meant to carry on together. I won't let Tucker take that from me. The passion in her voice stirred something in Miles. Admiration, certainly, but something deeper too. Something he hadn't felt since losing his own family land. Then we adapt, he said. Change the route, double the guards. And I think it's time I paid a visit to town, see what I can learn about Tucker's plans. Frances nodded, but concern shadowed her eyes. Be careful. Joshua went to town for answers and never returned. As Miles rode toward the small frontier town of Pine Creek later that day, Frances's warning echoed in his mind. The bustling main street appeared innocent enough. General store, saloon, hotel, and the small sheriff's office where a deputy dozed on the porch. Nothing to suggest danger. He tied his horse outside the saloon and entered, scanning the room carefully before approaching the bar. The bartender, a heavy-set man with an impressive mustache, eyed him warily. "Whiskey," Miles ordered, sliding a coin across the scarred wooden surface. "And information, if you're selling that too." The bartender poured his drink. "Depends on what kind of information." "I'm the new foreman at Evergreen Ranch," Miles said, keeping his voice casual. "Trying to get the lay of the land, so to speak." Something flickered in the bartender's eyes. "Eleanor Place? Heard she hired fresh blood." He leaned closer. "Word of advice, there's easier ways to make a living than working for that woman." "Oh." Miles took a measured sip of his whiskey. "Something wrong with Miss Eleanor?" The bartender glanced around before answering. "Let's just say the previous foreman wasn't the first man associated with that ranch to meet an untimely end. Some folks say the place is cursed." "I don't believe in curses," Miles replied evenly. "Then believe this. Tucker's got plans for that land, and he don't care much who gets in his way." The bartender straightened as the saloon doors swung open. "Speaking of the devil," Miles turned slightly to see three men enter. The largest, a bull-necked man with a gray-streaked beard, carried himself with the confidence of wealth and power. Harlan Tucker. The two men flanking him were clearly hired guns, their eyes cold and watchful. But it was the fourth man, hanging back near the door, who caught Miles' attention. Tall and lean, with a vicious scar running from his left eye to his jaw. The man Frances had seen. The man who looked like her supposedly dead brother. Miles turned back to the bar, keeping the scarred man in his peripheral vision. The group settled at a corner table, their conversation too low to overhear. But twice, the scarred man glanced in Miles' direction with unsettling intensity. After finishing his drink, Miles casually made his way toward the door. As he passed near Tucker's table, he deliberately stumbled slightly, catching himself on the back of an empty chair. "Watch yourself," Tucker growled. "This ain't the place for clumsy cowboys." "My apologies," Miles said, tipping his hat. The brief exchange gave him a chance to study the scarred man up close. The resemblance to Frances was subtle but unmistakable. Something about the eyes, the set of the jaw beneath the disfigurement. Outside, Miles mounted his horse and rode slowly out of town, his mind racing. If that man truly was Matthew Eleanor, why was he with Tucker? What could possibly have kept him from his sister all these years? The answer came sooner than expected. A mile outside town, hoofbeats approached rapidly from behind. Miles turned to see the scarred man gaining on him, riding alone. Miles pulled his horse to a stop, his hand resting near his gun. The scarred man halted several yards away. "You're the new foreman at Evergreen," the man said. It wasn't a question. "That's right," Miles answered cautiously. "And you are?" The man's hand drifted to his own weapon. "Someone who knows what happens to men who get too close to Frances Eleanor." Miles remained perfectly still. "Are you threatening me?" "Warning you." The scarred man's eyes, Frances's eyes, burned with dangerous intensity. 3 days from now, your cattle drive heads north. Change the route. Take them south instead. "Why would I do that?" "Because if you don't, what happened to Joshua will look merciful compared to what's coming." Without waiting for a response, the man wheeled his horse around and galloped back toward town. The encounter left Miles shaken. The man hadn't confirmed his identity, but he hadn't denied it either. And the warning, was it a threat or an attempt to protect them? Either way, Miles knew one thing for certain. He needed to tell Frances immediately. When he returned to Evergreen, however, Frances wasn't alone. A polished buggy stood in front of the main house, and through the window, Miles could see her engaged in conversation with a distinguished-looking gentleman in an expensive suit. Mrs. Abernathy intercepted him before he could enter. "Miss Eleanor is with Mr. Worthington from Denver," she explained. "A private matter." Miles retreated to the stables, his news burning inside him. While brushing down his horse, he heard footsteps approaching. Frances appeared in the doorway, her formal visiting dress a stark contrast to her usual practical attire. "You're back," she said, something uncertain in her expression. "How was town?" "Enlightening," Miles replied. "Your visitor seemed important." Frances joined him in the stall, absently stroking his horse's neck. "Thomas Worthington, my late husband's attorney. He came with an offer." "What kind of offer?" "Marriage." She said it flatly, watching for his reaction. "He's proposed 3 times in the past year. Says a woman can't possibly manage an operation this size alone indefinitely." Miles felt a strange tightness in his chest. And what do you say? I've always refused. Her eyes met his. But today, with Tucker's threats escalating, he made a compelling argument. His family has connections in Denver, political influence that could protect Evergreen. So you're considering it? Miles couldn't keep the edge from his voice. Frances moved closer. I don't love him. I never could. But you might marry him anyway, Miles finished for her. For protection. For Evergreen, she corrected softly. What would you have me do? I'm one woman against Tucker and his men. Even with you here. She broke off, struggling with emotions Miles had never seen her display so openly. The vulnerability in her expression pulled at something deep inside him. Without thinking, he closed the distance between them, his hand gently lifting her chin. I saw him, he said quietly. The man with the scar. Your brother. Frances went very still. Are you certain? He has your eyes, Miles confirmed. And he warned me to change the cattle drive route. South instead of north. Her breath caught. Then it is Matthew. After all these years. Tears welled in her eyes. But why is he with Tucker? Why wouldn't he come home? I don't know, Miles admitted. But I intend to find out. In that moment, with Frances looking up at him with a mixture of hope and fear, Miles couldn't resist any longer. He leaned down and pressed his lips gently to hers, a kiss that began as comfort but quickly deepened into something more urgent, more honest than any words between them. When they finally broke apart, Frances touched her fingers to her lips in wonder. I can't marry Thomas, she whispered. Not when I feel this way about you. Miles took her hand, pressing it against his heart. Then don't. Trust me instead. We'll solve this mystery together, and we'll save your ranch. The day of the cattle drive dawned clear and cool. Frances had made the difficult decision to follow the mysterious warning. They would drive the herd south instead of north, adding 2 days to their journey, but potentially avoiding whatever danger awaited on the usual trail. Miles had divided their men carefully, leaving enough hands to defend the ranch while taking their strongest cowboys with the herd. Frances herself insisted on riding with them, despite Miles' concerns. This is my ranch, my cattle, she'd said firmly. And if Matthew is out there, I need to see him for myself. They were a day into the drive when one of the outriders came galloping back to where Miles and Frances rode alongside the herd. Riders coming fast from the east, he reported, pointing toward a dust cloud in the distance. At least 6 men. Miles exchanged a glance with Frances. Get the men ready. Could be Tucker's boys. As the riders drew closer, however, Miles realized something was wrong. They weren't heading toward the herd but paralleling it, riding hard as if in pursuit of something or someone. Suddenly, a lone rider burst from a ravine ahead, horse lathered and clearly exhausted. The scarred man, Matthew, was bent low over his mount's neck, a dark stain spreading across his shoulder. Matthew! Frances cried out, spurring her horse forward before Miles could stop her. The wounded man looked up at her voice, his eyes widening in recognition. For a brief moment, brother and sister locked gazes across the distance. Then Matthew's horse stumbled, sending him crashing to the ground. Frances reached him first, dismounting in a flurry of skirts and dust. Miles was only seconds behind, positioning himself between them and the approaching riders, his rifle ready. Matthew, Frances was saying, cradling her brother's head. It's really you. What happened? Why didn't you come home? The scarred man grasped her hand weakly. Didn't, remember, he gasped. The flood had injury. Tucker found me. Told me lies. He coughed, blood speckling his lips. Only remembered when I saw your advertisement for a new foreman. Your handwriting. Miles kept his eyes on the approaching riders, now close enough to identify. Tucker himself led them, his face contorted with rage. Frances, Miles warned. We've got company. Matthew struggled to sit up. The government shipment, he said urgently. Tomorrow. Gold from Denver Mint. Tucker's planning to hit it where the trail crosses Cottonwood Creek. That's why. He wanted your land. Perfect ambush point. Frances's face hardened with understanding. And you betrayed him by warning us. Matthew nodded weakly. Remembered everything when I saw your writing. Had to protect you. Tucker's party was nearly upon them now. Miles signaled to their cowboys, who formed a protective line, weapons drawn. Stay down, Miles told Frances and Matthew, then stepped forward to meet Tucker. That's far enough, he called out, rifle raised. Tucker reined his horse to a stop, his men fanning out beside him. "You're harboring a traitor, Cowboy," he spat. "That man stole something from me." "His own memories?" Miles countered. "Or are you worried about what he'll tell the authorities about your plans for the gold shipment?" Tucker's face contorted with surprise, then fury. "You're dead, all of you. You think your little cattle drive detour fooled me? I've got men waiting at your ranch right now. While you're out here playing hero, Evergreen will be nothing but ashes." The blood drained from Frances's face. "You wouldn't dare," she said, rising to her feet. Tucker laughed, an ugly sound. "Your father refused to sell to my father. Your husband refused to sell to me. I'm done asking, Frances. By sundown, that land will be mine one way or another." What happened next unfolded in a blur of violence. One of Tucker's men drew his weapon. Miles fired first, dropping the man from his saddle. Gunfire erupted from both sides, the cattle bellowing in panic as bullets filled the air. Miles dove for Frances, knocking her to the ground as a bullet whizzed overhead. Matthew, despite his injuries, had pulled his own gun and fired from his position on the ground, his aim deadly accurate. When the shooting stopped, Tucker and one of his men had fled. The rest lay motionless on the blood-soaked earth. Miles had taken a bullet to his arm, but remained standing. Two of their cowboys were wounded, none killed. "We have to get back to the ranch," Frances said, her voice steady despite the chaos. "Right now." Matthew struggled to his feet, swaying slightly. "I'll come with you." Miles quickly organized their men. Half would continue with the cattle, too valuable to abandon, while he, Frances, Matthew, and the others would race back to defend Evergreen. They rode hard, pushing their horses to the limit. As they crested the final hill overlooking the ranch, Frances gasped in horror. Smoke rose from one of the distant pastures, but the main house and buildings still stood intact. More importantly, they could see figures moving about, their remaining hands engaged in what appeared to be a firefight with Tucker's men. "They're holding them off," Miles said with relief. Matthew nodded grimly. "Tucker would have sent his men ahead while he dealt with us. He didn't expect to fail." They thundered down the hillside, the element of surprise giving them the advantage. Caught between defenders from the house and the returning riders, Tucker's men quickly scattered into the surrounding countryside. As sunset painted the sky crimson, Frances stood on her porch surveying the damage. One barn had been lost to fire, 3 hands wounded, but the ranch, her legacy, still stood. Miles joined her, his arm freshly bandaged by the town doctor who'd been summoned to treat the injured. "We need to get word to the authorities about the gold shipment," he said. "Tucker's still out there." "Matthew's already sent one of the boys to the nearest telegraph office," she replied, turning to face him. "It's over, Miles. Thanks to you." He shook his head. "Thanks to your brother. If he hadn't warned us." "But you believed in me," she said softly. "You believed in the possibility that my brother was alive when everyone else thought I was clinging to false hope. You stood by me when you could have walked away." Miles took her hand, mindful of the ranch hands and her brother watching from a respectful distance. "I couldn't walk away from you, Frances. Not then, not now. Mr. Worthington would say this makes a very poor business decision," she said, a smile playing at her lips. "Falling in love with my foreman. Is that what you've done?" Miles asked, hope rising in his chest. "Fallen in love with me?" Frances Eleanor, who had defied convention at every turn, who had run a ranch alone when society said she couldn't, who had never stopped believing her brother would return. This remarkable woman now stood on tiptoe and kissed Miles Thompson for all to see. "Yes," she whispered against his lips. "Though I suspect I began falling the first time I saw you gentle that wild stallion at Morrison's ranch." Miles laughed softly. "You really were watching me all along. And I intend to keep watching you," she replied, "for the rest of our lives." 3 months later, as winter settled over the Colorado Territory, Evergreen Ranch hosted a most unusual celebration. Frances Eleanor became Frances Thompson in a ceremony performed in the main house, with her brother Matthew as witness. Harlan Tucker, it was reported, had fled to Mexico after his plan to rob the gold shipment was exposed. With his criminal activities revealed, his creditors had seized his property, land that was now being divided and sold to local ranchers, including a prime parcel with water rights that Frances purchased as a wedding gift for Miles. That night, as snow fell gently outside their window, Frances lay in her husband's arms, her head resting on his chest. "Do you remember the letter you found?" she asked quietly. "The one in the Iliad?" Miles nodded, his fingers tracing patterns on her bare shoulder. "The unfinished letter to Jay. I always wondered about it." Frances propped herself up to look at him. "I wrote it to Joshua, my former foreman. I was going to tell him everything, about the flood, about what really happened the day Matthew disappeared." She took a deep breath. "Our father was with us that day. He survived too. But he'd been drinking. His negligence nearly killed us all, and he couldn't face it. He made me promise never to tell anyone he was there." "That's a heavy burden for a child," Miles said gently. "It was," she agreed. "When Father died, I wanted to tell Joshua the truth, but I never found the courage. Then he died too, and the secret remained mine alone, until Matthew returned." Miles pulled her closer. "And now you've shared it with me. No more secrets between us," Frances promised. "Only truth and trust and love." Outside, the snow continued to fall on Evergreen Ranch, covering the land in a blanket of pristine white. Land that had witnessed tragedy and triumph, separation and reunion, and finally, the love story of a poor cowboy and the rich woman who had been watching him all along.